So this is the supply chain finance panel. I think we've got an eclectic panel, a number of people from both private enterprise, technology, academia joining us. So, wanted to thank you for attending, USC giving us the opportunity. Myself, Geoff Gallipeau, I lead our trade sales efforts in Canada from a global trade and supply chain finance perspective. So I cover our large corporates and global commercial clients operating in the country. Supply chain finance in a nutshell is a working capital optimization tool meant to provide buyers and suppliers with the ability to generate additional free cash flow. And typically, it underpins a broader supply chain transformation. And that's really, how we wanted to frame today's panel. And we'll sort of touch on three key trends, I think, that we've continued to observe coming out of the pandemic, namely sustainability. Obviously a critical topic I think will be discussed potentially ad nauseum at this conference and continues to be, I think very topical with our clients, certainly at Bank of America. Operating in a post-pandemic world, what trends have we observed? How have companies adapted? What does the future look like? And then we'll address technology, right? Adapting to change. Again, what are companies looking at? How are we looking to improve, streamline, become more efficient from a supply chain perspective? So a bit more broad, we won't necessarily focus on the nuts and bolts of actual supply chain financing, but more the key trends that are supporting, certainly what we see at the bank and certainly what the panelists are observing in the market. So with that, I think maybe I'll hand it over to Dominic to kick off introductions and we'll go from there.
Sure. Dominic Capolongo. I am the Chief Revenue Officer of Liquidx, which is a supply chain platform serving corporates, trade insurers, and banks. Our platform is AI-based, machine learning focused, and serves the needs of corporate treasuries, as well as the other folks in the supply chain ecosystem, and is pretty active at this point, as you might suspect, in terms of deriving efficiencies in the market through technology.
Great.
Hello, everyone. My name is Alvin Moreno. I'm actually first cohort of the Global Supply Chain Management at USC. This is my 10th summit. Basically, I'm with Nestle. I'm the Director of Global Supply Chain Credit Risk. We look at our vendors and their financial capacity and how that translates to risk, whether it's a supply chain or a financial risk to the organization. So in a nutshell, that's my influence into this panel.
I'm Laird Burns. I get the opportunity to play a couple of different roles. I'm an associate professor of management science at the University of Alabama in Huntsville. So if you know where the birthplace of NASA is, that's where we are. We're literally next door. My team there has both supply chain graduate programs and analytics graduate programs. And so I get the privilege of having the academic side. I also have a small business on the side where we do AI algorithms, for example, to forecast what are considered unforecastable items, right, where the data just doesn't fit the patterns and the risk is too high. And so I'll try to talk a little bit today about some of the trends that we see as well.
Perfect. So thanks, guys. So I'll also mention that there will be sort of 10 minutes, or the goal is to have 10 minutes for questions at the end of this. So sort of be prepared for that. We'll have a hot mic sort of passed around as and when we're ready. But I think, look, we'll kick off with the first sort of trend that we're observing, which is sustainability. Certainly something we see at Bank of America as clients continue to move towards a more net zero environment as they look at supply chains, but generally as they look at, how they're lending money from banks, and certainly at Bank of America, how we approach that process in terms of evaluating opportunities. But look, I think first question, we'll start with you, Alvin, if you don't mind. So how have corporates integrated sustainability, either environmental or social, into their procurement or sourcing practices, which includes financing activities in the supply chain? What criteria or methodology are they using? Is there a standard process that you've observed? And how would you qualify a supplier's quote-unquote ESG status, sustainability status? So maybe we'll kick off.
There's different steps to approaching that. There's different ways of capturing it. The most important one is, how do you measure it? How do you account for it? So there's different ways of approaching that. I mean, the key thing is, how do you account for it? How do you measure it? how do you discover and have transparency into your supply chain and the ESG piece to it? I mean, it's good business to focus on it, obviously, because there's more and more pressure on it. You want to make sure that you focus on sustainability, renewable, and things like that, and social responsibility. So there's always a link on the financial, there's always a link on the risk and resiliency and sustainability. Is there a set framework? No, it's work in progress. I mean, it's live and learn on that one, but it's evolving. So that's why it's important to be part of like this center, because you're exposed to the best practices and the best trends, and you can basically learn from those.
So, I mean, let me just build on that. One of the things that I would encourage you all to think about as you listen to this panel is the influence that the financial decisions that a company makes, the influence of those decisions on the viability, the resiliency, as Alvin mentioned, of the supply chain. In a world where we're in now, where getting access to goods and services is getting tougher, cost is increasing, it's important for corporations to build strength in their supply chain, to reinforce the relationships that they have with their suppliers. If a company for the social good wants to press forward with ESG initiatives, and Europe is far further ahead than the U.S. in that regard. Everywhere you go, everything is designated as a green item or in some way. So a big push. If you want to press that into your supply chain, you've got to make sure you provide the suppliers with the financing necessary to achieve those goals. So a lot of supply chain finance deals, while they may not appear to do more than just provide capital to the sponsoring company, the buyer in many cases, they actually reinforce the relationships and strengthen the businesses of the suppliers, and create a much more solid foundation and infrastructure. So ESG, again, like Alvin said, is a work in progress. There are no standards. People are trying to figure out daily, how best to repay or reward people for complying, and there's everything from financial incentives to becoming a preferred vendor, things like that. But again, the importance is making sure that your suppliers are set up to succeed, not putting a burden on them that they can't achieve because they don't have the capital to do so.
And if you look at this, there's an evolutionary aspect to it, right? Dean Garrett talked about things as they evolved over time, and he walked back and said, in certain areas like blockchain, we're kind of where we were in the 90s. We don't have standards. We're working on that. They will evolve into some standard. But if you look back, for example, into the 70s, you look at the auto industry. The U.S. auto industry had the big three that we all remember, and the Japanese cars were not particularly high quality. Well, the Japanese are resource scarce, and so they wisely said, how do we compete against these giant American companies in America? And they figured out these things called quality systems that we understand so well now, but back then we didn't understand them. And they came along and the Japanese improved their quality, and they kept improving their quality to the point where it was so much better than ours that we finally realized it was better, and we started buying cars, and people said, well, I love the American cars, but I'm not going to pay for these breakdowns. I want reliable cars. And so they changed the paradigm. But at one point, the US government accused them of what's called dumping. Dumping is where a country subsidizes an industry to underprice the final product to steal market share. And the Japanese, it turns out, were not dumping. We thought in order to improve, to get better quality, you had to spend more money. When you look at it and you study it, by improving the efficiencies and reducing waste, the Japanese were actually spending less money to get higher quality. And we eventually in the 80s and 90s started learning that as our auto industry went through that kind of pain. And so you get this evolutionary aspect, but there's a lot of supply chain finance implications for companies trying to go through these transformational changes. Ford, for example, in the 80s and 90s, said, we want to be sustainable. We want to improve this. The challenge at that time was they were going to spend a lot of money to do sustainability, but it was very difficult in their market to do that because the other companies were not doing it. Now, as you heard from Dean Garrett and you heard from Torsten from Honeywell, it's profitable to engineer in the architecture to make these systems more efficient, right? When Germany, several years ago, many years ago now, decided that 80% of automobiles had to be recyclable in order to compete in the German market, that was a huge impact. And it was challenging for the transformation. And there were many years of delays as suppliers did it. They had bumpers, for example, with so many different mixes of plastics, you couldn't recycle them, right? Dashboards. And now that industry has evolved. So like blockchain and other technologies, sustainability is becoming more mainstream. We're not there, but we're starting to settle down in what you don't do to be sustainable and how you do it while still being profitable and stay in business. And how do you fund the working capital? And oh, by the way, we got organizations like Nestle saying we want many of these supply chain characteristics and performance, including sustainability. So now it's becoming an ante, right? It used to be a bonus that you could do this. Now it's becoming a requirement for companies to compete and do that. So particularly for the students in the room, there's a lot of interesting history in how industries evolve. And in this case, I use the example of money. It's kind of like the lifeblood of supply chains, right? We go to the doctor and, you know, our hearts are beating and we're still moving and they're doing their tests, and they never say, well, let me drain your blood out for an hour and do the test, and I'll tell you later when I bring you back to life, you know, with some electrical shock, how it is. It's a dynamic live system. These supply chains are very complex, dynamic, live systems, and cash flow is the lifeblood. And we'll talk a little bit more about that.
So let me give you a vision as we move, before we move on to the next question, about what the future of ESG could look like using technology. So we're all familiar with carbon credits. We've probably all heard about them. With the influence of blockchain technology, what you will see in my prediction in probably 24 months' time is the tokenization of all the invoices and the declaration of certain invoices because of sustainability metrics in a way that will allow them to be traded much more favorably on a marketplace. I think, you know, once you tokenize the invoice, once you tokenize the asset, it'll be easier to apply social benefits to it and give it a much more liquid market to support it. So I think that's one of the things that you will see a lot of is in this digitization journey we're all on now in supply chain are things that ways that we're going to take the underlying asset and make it more attractive to, you know, secondary market buyers.
So one last comment since I opened it.
Sure.
I want to close it. So one of the things that it's really important to understand is as brilliant as the decisions have been in the past, right, with sustainability, with ESG and the financial element, it's an ever-changing environment. If you look at the last decade, it was all focused on efficiency, cost reduction, right? Not much on resiliency as it was covered earlier, right? And I remember always bringing that up. As we basically reduce the number of suppliers, we concentrate, you're adding a risk. Because if you have a failure, you're going to have a catastrophic failure. It's not like one of 50 suppliers failing. If you have one of 2 and you're that concentrated, you will lead to a disruption. That's a financial impact. Goes back to finance, right? Lost revenues. Now with COVID, right, we looked at most companies were really focused on just in time, on basically maximizing utilization. We did not have the elasticity to respond to the sudden demand on the CPG front, right? And lesson learned. Now, you know, there's a lot more focus on resiliency. If you paid attention to the mission statement of the center, it focuses on risk and resiliency. But by trade, I'm in risk. I'm not in supply chain per se. I'm part of the supply chain, but I focus on risk. Now that shift is on risk, resiliency, the importance of a sustainable supply chain. Finance backs into that, right? So it's not just about efficiency anymore. It's a wider lens that needs to be focused on and how finance supports that, on those decisions. I mean, you have to look at the financial element. Does it make sense to invest on the CapEx for that? What's the return on it? But there needs to be factors that are encompassing on sustainability, green, right, renewable energies, and also adding elasticity to our supply chain. So those are the comments that I would like to close with.
Yeah, I think certainly coming out of the pandemic, you know, what I've sort of observed in the Canadian market, in the US market as well, you know, clients who didn't have a sustainability framework 2 or 3 years ago, you know, they've built it out, they've thought about it, looking to provide suppliers in the supply chain with additional value and looking to the bank with, you know, how they can do that and sort of other partners across the supply chain. So I think it's becoming critically important, and you'll notice each of these topics sort of feed into each other, and ultimately it is about resiliency. Sort of as you experience shocks in your supply chain, how can you mitigate them, and how can you lessen those effects? So, you know, dovetails into the next topic, which, you know, I've titled Operating in a Post-Pandemic Environment. Really could be alternatively titled Resiliency, but, you know, I'll turn it to you, Laird, to take this one. But, you know, what trends have you observed in sort of a post-pandemic world across supply chains, and looking at the corporate landscape as it relates to sourcing and procurement, and where have there been sort of strategic shifts in terms of how companies source from and finance their
Okay,
supply chains?
thank you. Let's take a look first kind of at a larger picture. So some of the research my colleagues and I have done looked at Brexit, and it looked at trade tariffs, right? President Trump, a number of years ago, started a conversation with China that was pretty much a pretty tough conversation about, hey, wait a minute, trade imbalance, and we want fair playing field and all these kinds of things. And we had some other challenges in the world. The economies were going up and down, and then all of a sudden, COVID hit, right? And some of us remember very well, you remember a couple of years ago, it was 2 days before this conference, actually no, it was the March conference here at USC, 2 days before, Nick had to call it off because of COVID, right? And we didn't really fully understand. We heard about COVID, we knew it was happening, we didn't truly understand the implications. But folks like me who have actually done computer models of supply chain disruptions and dynamics know all the different feedback loops you can get. So again, you've got Brexit going on, which has got some European dynamics. You've got the trade war with China. We've got other things going on, economies, and all of a sudden COVID hits. And we don't understand what that really means. We found out that for a little while, China had to shut down factories, right? They didn't supply. So now we've got a hit to supply. We've got stable demand and no supply, or very little. And then all of a sudden, China, not too long after, 30, 60 days, because they locked down so well, started bringing back supply. But in that first 30 days, we panicked. We said, oh my goodness, we have to order a bunch more, because as soon as they come back up, we're going to be behind. So they ordered a bunch more. And for those of you students, you're going to learn about this thing called the BOAP effect, right? It's the only thing my students have to memorize, the amplification of demand variation as it propagates upstream in a supply chain. So every time you order, you find out that 30, 60, 90 days, as that's starting to come in, oh my gosh, now the demand side started dropping, because in the US we were locking down and people weren't going to work and factories were shutting down, so it was impacting demand. But now the supply was already starting to slowly come in, and there were months of that was going to be coming in. And so you get multiple shocks simultaneously stacking up on each other. So instead of a blow-up effect like this, you have multiple effects simultaneously creating these negative feedback loops. We had, as we know, never seen anything like this in supply chains. And I'm in the area of supply chains and analytics, so all of a sudden, as you guys know, that became so, the whole world now knows what a supply chain is and what analytics are. But as we go through these challenges, we then see that the pandemic is settling down, people are getting back to work, but we're still watching these effects, right? And so when you go into supply chain finance, some of the research we did with companies globally, where they had multiple operating plants. So we had data from China and South America and North America and Europe and some different locations. And we compared the timing of these effects. But one of the first things that happened was, because supply dried up, they ran into cash flow problems. Working capital was becoming critical. And then when supply was coming back and they had worked through the first stages of financing that, then demand was drying up. And so many companies were not just working very hard trying to get supply and maintain their demand. They were in cash flow crisis. They were in survival mode. Many companies failed. A lot of companies did not. But then we had to have these different alternatives that we'll talk more about for supply chain finance. There are so many different flavors of how to do this. And those are the kinds of effects we're still seeing, right? If you look at, the Honeywells of the world and the Port of Long Beach, and they're all looking at different new innovative ways to create drivers of future success. We've got disruptive technologies going on. All of those are other effects, but all of it comes down to the lifeblood of supply chain finance. And how do we now anticipate, right? Alvin talked about, it used to be all on efficiency. We were buying from China and from East Asia, and now we're talking about localization. I have a running bet with some of my colleagues on how long that's going to last, because for a while, we had the innovators doing globalization. Then the accounting folks said, hey, let's get efficient, right? Because it was a pretty stable supply, kind of like Russian gas. And then all of a sudden, we've got issues with that. Oh my goodness, we forgot all about this thing called resilience, right? Some of us knew that was always there, but you could not get attention. No, we've got to have it on cost. We're going to be focusing on resilience and redesigning supply chain architectures in the next 5 years. We'll see how long it lasts before the competing competitive priorities in the organizational suites evolve to say, does resilience stay? And if it does, what's the balancing act, right? And how does that evolve? So I'm interested in what you guys have in a perspective on that, because I think it's cool.
To your point, it's the flavor of the month. Let's go back, 2009, we had a financial crisis, right? There was all this focus on, oh, you got to look at your suppliers, right? Nestle took steps to take a look at the suppliers globally. What's their financial health? What is their capacity? What's the concentration? How could this lead to a financial disruption or a supply chain disruption, right? If you look at public companies, they always have to disclose the risk factors. You're going to find in their 10Ks, usually it says, we've taken steps to identify and mitigate the potential risks to supply chain, among other risks, right? You could have cost of capital, you could have interest rates, you have a number of different things. But then, to your point, enough time passes, and then you have to deal with competing, competing thoughts within the organization. What's more important? And that's the danger of it. You forget, that things happen, because things continue to revisit us, right? We haven't had a pandemic like this before. I mean, there was one called the Spanish flu. Not because it started in Spain, but because Spain was the first one to identify it and communicate it, right? It was the Spanish flu, right? Nothing so much different than COVID. So, but it happened, a century apart. But at the end of the day, the importance to not forget resiliency, not forget that risk factor. It's not just on the efficiency piece. The efficiency should also include elements like resiliency and, black swan effects and, basically at least identify the things that can really hurt your business, right? And then marry it with the financial aspect of it.
Yeah, I mean, I'll just sort of reiterate what I had said before and just expand slightly upon it. Do not think that a supply chain finance transaction is simply meant to produce money. It is an offshoot of it. Any financing transaction generates some form of capital. And financing receivables is a tried and true method that corporations use to clean up their balance sheet and convert somewhat illiquid assets to cash. Supply chain, as it's done today, is more broadly strategic. I'll give you a real live example. Trucking companies are having a really, really hard time finding drivers. It is an extraordinarily competitive market. There is a company, a gentleman speaking here at this conference, that has technology that largely helps companies identify and find truckers, and truckers find companies to work for. There are a lot of things that are going into it that never existed in terms of what the decision factors are for both parties. One of the key features is who's going to pay me faster. I can pay a lot more, but if I don't pay somebody quickly, I'm not as attractive necessarily. There are a number of trucking companies around the world that are using supply chain finance to create an environment to pay their truckers more quickly, to make them more attractive, to retain the talent. and be able to continue to provide the service to their customers. That is, the companies that are sponsoring those transactions are not doing it for their own financial good, other than resiliency within their core business and the generation of revenue. It is a far more strategic decision. So I'll just leave you with that. The world is changing big time. I started out, inventory finance was a big component of supply chain finance. That went away with just-in-time supply chain. It is going to come back over the next 12, 24, 36 months as people realize they need to have a hedge against disruptions in the supply chain. So inventory finance will grow again as for a strategic reason, not just for the provision of capital.
So you brought up a really interesting point, how supply chain finance is not just about improving the bottom line, but actually as a tool to improve on your business. Mm-hmm. Think about it. I started in credit. Credit is known, as the sales prevention department, right? But actually, if you think about it more broadly, what is credit? It's the ability to sell more, provide terms to your buyers so that you're able to sell more. It's a tool. It's just an extension of your financial toolbox. In the same manner, it applies to supply chain in every aspect of your business. It's not just about the direct impact to your bottom line, but the indirect impact to your bottom line. How to facilitate, how to become more resilient, how to improve upon your model. So.
Yeah, I think certainly what I've observed, quite a bit more nearshoring. So, you're sourcing something from overseas, whether it's APAC or another region, you're processing something overseas, it's getting shipped over, manufacturing. So companies are really looking at, how do I finance this CapEx? I'm trying to backstop my supply chain, make it more reliable. Local is obviously a critical focus. Something I continue to see, acquisitions of their largest strategic suppliers, so vertically integrating, how you're supplied, how you manufacture, again, very much a common trend, and obviously that has a strain on cash flow, so it's how do we look at our supply chain and make it as the most efficient tool as possible using financing tools to do that. So, just a couple of key trends that we're certainly seeing in the market. But with that, maybe Dom, I'll turn it over to you for the final sort of question and topic. But it's really technology, right? We've touched on it throughout this panel so far, but certainly at Bank of America, we're always challenged by clients to continuously improve our platforms. Try to inform what our clients are doing through the use of data. I think distributed ledger technology. These types of technologies that banks are looking at, companies are looking at, will continue to grow in popularity and will be more commercialized. But really wanted to know, what are we seeing in terms of the evolution and deployment of technology as it relates to supply chains? Given the immense disruption we're seeing, increased cybersecurity concerns, in general operational stability, what are companies doing to really address that?
So, look, we've all seen the advent and the growth in the use of technology in every kind of business process. Supply chain management is no different. The biggest issue over the years have been separate systems, separate technologies being developed for different components of the supply chain. So, if you're a corporate, you could have SAP or Oracle for some of your systems, and then you might need to use HighRadius, for example, to reconcile invoices and payments. You'd buy two systems and to get effectively the end-to-end solution. In other places, you'd have to buy three systems. Banks could buy a system to help manage the individual platform, the transaction with an individual company, but then had to worry about how do they book it in their own back office systems, how do they manage the flow of paper and process the documents and everything else, and those may be separate systems. So that's what's been happening, and so that has helped to accelerate the adoption and improve the efficiency of supply chain finance because it gives you the tools to integrate into your overall supply chain management. But again, it was multiple systems. Where we're going now in terms of the market is the consolidation of those multiple systems into one end-to-end solution. So you're seeing newer companies like ours, which is backed by Broadridge, which manages back office systems for pretty much all the big banks around the world, looking at providing an end-to-end solution for the providers. Instead of going and buying 3 systems, you do everything on one system. That creates additional efficiency. It allows more expense management, which, as we all know, expense management has become a huge component of the profitability of companies as prices compress and the availability of new transactions becomes more of a challenge in terms of origination. But it also opens the availability of supply chain finance to far more companies. A large global company can manage a supply chain finance program. They can provide the benefit to their suppliers. They have the administrative resources, the headcount to support that. Obviously, they look for efficiencies in that headcount, but they at least have that headcount. A smaller company, a mid-market company, some company with $500 or so million in revenue, is not going to have the numbers in the back office to manage. And so as you continue to compress this into one technology, it becomes easier to do it with a single head at a company like that, which makes supply chain much more available, allows those companies to get the benefits strategically that were only afforded to global companies. So I would say to you, what you're going to start to see is a consolidation in the industry of the various technologies into more of an end-to-end solution. I will also tell you that you're going to see far more focus on kind of opening access to supply chain finance to small and medium-sized enterprises and making the product more accessible to those folks, more of an even playing field with the larger companies. The negative of all that is it commoditizes the product, which means that the banks and other providers are going to need to look for more efficiencies in their systems to enable them to provide this product profitably. So those are the key trends I'd say from the technology side.
So one of the interesting things about these technologies is a lot of times smaller companies are the sources of technology, right? And then as they evolve and they compete, some survive, some die, some join, and eventually, oftentimes larger companies say, hey, that's evolved enough, I want to bring that in-house, and I've got to integrate it. One of the things that my colleague and I mentioned, I've got a PhD in supply chain disruptions and a background in complex systems analytics. My buddy's got a PhD in physics and a background in complex systems. And we were hired by an organization, one of the world's most complex supply chains. And they said, hey, we've got issues with inventory and forecasting. And that can be a challenge in a lot of industries. But if you're doing, I'm just saying, soup and diapers, those will fit a normal distribution. But most of the time, the products don't fit those well. And in some cases, and one of the areas we work in is highly engineered long life systems, that you can't forecast those well at all. And so as we did it, my buddy and I developed, and it's not an ad, I'm just explaining the background. This is AI enhanced forecasting capabilities. And then from there, we can look at the risk profiles and where you've got to stock and all these kinds of things. And they save them a lot of money because inventory and storage and transportation is very expensive. And so it's a way to reduce waste. Well, the challenge is that the client says, I want it integrated. I've got, it could be Oracle, SAP. I've got, let's just say, an SAP system. And I don't want people swiveling chairs from some Excel spreadsheet to this and that. It's got to be integrated. And so we had to partner up with a company with a specialty in this integration so that when the client looks at it and sees it, they see it inside their system. We don't, change a lot in their system other than produce the particular results they need, and we feed it in through their data tables so it pulls up into their system as an integrated piece, because that's a critical requirement. But when you do that, now you've got these cybersecurity technology requirements. So now let's say you're a small or medium-sized company and you have a big organization that has world-class cybersecurity practices, but they demand their suppliers have world-class cybersecurity practices because that's the easiest way to get in. And now you're a smaller innovator and you have this very high technical hurdle. So now you've got to figure out, do I have to build this myself? Can I do it? Do I have to finance it? Do I have to get the upfront investment? And so as you look at your organizations and you look at technology development, there is a gestation period, there's an evolution, there's a trial and error process, there's a way to evolve these, and you have to manage the cash flow. And if you find some innovative suppliers, you have to find ways through supply chain finance and other ways to do it. You may, for example, work with a company, one of the companies I work with, we didn't need the investment, we had the capability to do that. But if you were a less capable, from a financial perspective, supplier, you could finance it through the organization. They would work through a third-party Bank of America or somebody else. But what happened is that organization, unlike the bank, knew the ins and outs of that industry. And they knew the ins and outs of your technology. So they could give a better assessment of the risk profile. And oh, by the way, say, not necessarily us, but to the bank, we see this technology be used in this ways in our business. So we think that's going to be around for a while, and whether it's this company or another one. So now you've reduced the risk through the OEMs and working with the financial partners to be able to allow those technologies to be developed. So it's a complex, multi-moving system, right? Again, it's, finance always ends up in the lifeblood of this because you can develop all you want. If you can't sell it and get paid for it in time and you go bankrupt, you're out of the game.
Yeah, so from a finance perspective, everything's about what's my return on my investment at the end of the day. If I'm going to invest on this technology, digitalization, how much investment is it and when am I going to get back, right? But you touched on something. It's all about making your systems talk to each other, right? We're talking internally. But when you take that and apply it externally, there's an opportunity that you can get your data points from your sources outside of your organization, like demand, so you can plan better. You can predict, how much product you're going to move, whether it's a seasonal impact. Now you're driving more data points, like, for example, how hot a summer is, how cold the winter is, how that's going to impact it. I mean, from a user of technology, granularly how we apply it, the challenge is, how do I get information from, let's say, credit agencies, whether it's Bloomberg, Moody's, Fitch, Standard & Poor's, DNB, right, Experian, COFAS. How do I get those data points into my system so I can crunch those numbers, turn it into data that's usable to predict risk, to predict other elements of the business? So that's where digitalization comes in. And now you got to basically take a step back and say, well, it's going to require an investment. Now you got to sell that, right? What's my payoff? What's my return? What's my MIR on it? What's my modified internal rate of return on it? What's the present and future value of that investment? So that's where the financial element comes in, and it's good to understand and marry with your other aspects of the business. And there's a great opportunity in the digitalization and how finance supports that.
Yeah, I think, look, we've got a few minutes just before the Q&A period. I wanted to put an ad hoc question maybe to the panel. Softball, don't worry. But what in terms of one key trend you think everybody in the audience should focus on sort of the next 3 to 5 years as you look at supply chains? I mean, you can focus on supply chain finance if you want, but keep it more broad. Is there one sort of key, I guess, trend that you think will be relevant? Maybe Laird?
So I think we've all talked about this. Supply chains are integrated systems. I teach a graduate and undergraduate class in supply chains. I got my PhD from Michigan State, which is arguably the best supply chain program in the world, except maybe USC.
That's right.
And as you go through these challenges, I don't use a textbook in those classes, and I'll tell you why. So I've got a background in operations and logistics and distribution in all these areas, sourcing. And most of the textbooks are an operations book with some supply chain flavor called supply chain whatever, or the logistics with a supply chain flavor, or purchasing with a supply chain flavor. And even when you get a straight up supply chain book, 60% of the content is from operations and logistics, right? I teach it from a systems view. So as students, do listen to your professors. The textbooks are very valuable, but also look at some of the key classical articles and some of the more recent cutting edge ideas. And that includes, INSEAD or McKinsey or somebody who's writing some of these really interesting reports where they're working with industry and they're helping to see some of these trends coming and say, how do we do the integrated system aspect? These are highly complex, nonlinear systems. And we used to try to optimize inventory or transportation. That doesn't do us any good. Even the auto companies, to become world-class and compete with the Japanese, had to develop just-in-time production plants. That doesn't mean the manufacturing is necessarily just in time, but they had to orchestrate, almost like literally an orchestra leader. How do I get all my products at the right place, in the right configuration, the right quantity, and the right style and SKU simultaneously, because they run on 1 and 2 hour inventories in those automotive plants, right? They synchronize. It's an amazing feat that takes a lot of energy. But as you go through that, it is about this complex system, as we saw this morning. I've got issues with boats in the harbor. I don't have people who, can staff the docks. I've got transportation problems. I've got container shortages. Every one of those elements in that complex system will shut down the supply chain. So while you're focusing on the latest thing you're freaking out about, as Alvin knows, you've got a whole bunch of other things hanging in the wings you also have to pay attention to, or because even if you make progress on one, those other problems are going to crop up and cause you issues. And it's all about how do you maintain the investment and the priorities and the financial strength to support the company and your suppliers as you go through the challenge.
I mean, I agree with you 100%. But the only other thing, I would focus on is, how technology is moving and how it's affecting the world. I don't know if all of you guys know what a typewriter looks like, right? It's funny, you look at movies like, I'm big on movies, Saving Private Ryan. There's a scene where there's a room full of typists typing letters, we're sorry your son was killed in battle. When you think about it, that all got replaced by something as small as this, word processor technology, right? You don't need 100 people typing letters, you have a word processor, right? I remember when Microsoft was introduced, it's like, wow, I went into those first sessions. You can take Excel and Word and PowerPoint and integrate them all together? That was a big deal. To you, it's not, right? Think about where you're going to be 10 years from now, 20 years from now, the advances in technology. So my focus, I would tell you, because of COVID, and I would say resiliency, but at the end of the day, it's nothing without the technology and innovation that goes into, right? And don't get comfortable. Things are always changing. You turn around, you better stay tuned with the advances in technology and the changes, because if you don't, you're going to become obsolete, right? So based on that, I would say the greatest focus is technology and how you can make better use of that technology to become more efficient, more resilient, and how to use finance more efficiently, right? You need to know where you can spend that money, where you're going to get the biggest bang for the buck, and not just blindly throw money at your supply chain.
So I'll cap it off with a 1-minute answer. So you've heard it through here, but the word that I think you all should focus on over the near term is digitization. Notwithstanding every advancement, there is a ton of paper still in the supply chain. You talk about the logistical side of it. Marine insurance is on paper. Warehouse receipts are on paper. There are very few technologies that have currently, to date, digitized that. So there's wet signatures and everything else. DocuSign, is a wonderful thing, but hasn't been adopted in a big way in the trade area. So to everything we've said, it's all about efficiency. The biggest thing is converting all of that paper that still exists in the supply chain into a digital asset, a token, and then from there, the tokenization and the digitization of those component parts will open up access to folks for financing, will improve the efficiency of financing that's available, and will make the processes far more cost-effective because you have far fewer hands touching everything along the way. So digitization, blockchain is a component of it, AI is a component of it, but digitization is the big word for the next years.
Yeah, I think, and thanks for that. I think, and again, speaking purely from a banking perspective, I think AI, machine learning, these are increasing coming out of the pandemic. Certainly when you quiz clients in the market, these are focus points for them, and how do you become more efficient? Especially, if you have a food products plant where, let's say in a future pandemic, if there ever is one, a bunch of people aren't on the floor manufacturing, producing product, like you're very challenged when that happens as a business. So how do you automate components of that business, and how do you continue to support your supply chain, and manage through these disruptions? So I think certainly AI and automation and data ultimately. So how can you use, certainly as a bank, we sit on a ton of data, and we're constantly thinking about how can we use this data to support a client's decision as it relates to financing, or just as it relates to their business more broadly. That can be from a supply chain perspective or other components of their business. So, I think that's what we continue to see on an ongoing basis.
30 seconds more. So let me give
Sure.
you a practical example of, so you understand what digitization is within the supply chain. So you're all familiar with self-driving cars, right? You know how they work, you've seen them and everything. The technology that goes into self-driving cars is what is going to be applied, currently is being applied, to take a physical asset in the supply chain, an invoice, a trade insurance contract, a purchase order. Any of those documents can be converted using the exact same technology to a data field, or a number of data fields. So all you have to do effectively is, instead of teaching the system, this is a curb and avoid it, that's a person, don't hit it, this is a red light, don't go through it. You teach the same kind of recognition. It's the same basic technology that we use currently. I've got two guys that kind of lead that effort for me. Both of them are less than half my age. Both of them have 3 or 4 degrees. One has 2 doctorates, the other has 2 masters and a doctorate. So they're all very smart, and all they're doing is taking that same technology and applying it to convert an invoice, a trade contract, a warehouse receipt into a set of data fields that then can be retrieved, used, converted into a token, analyzed for smarter, faster, better processes in a company's supply chain.
Great. So if I could put a pitch in for the students, for those of you in the program, it's a great program, it really is. A lot of good stuff in the curriculum. Take whatever additional analytics classes you can take, but it's not about the analytics alone. You can have a great answer if you can explain it to senior leadership so that they can make better decisions. And I was having a conversation with somebody who's working on her PhD. She said, they tell me to dumb it down in my company. And I said, well, what you really need is not to dumb it down. Here's an example. So back in the 1800s, Mark Twain wrote a letter to somebody, and he said, I apologize for the long letter. I didn't have time to write a short one. What does that mean for a professional writer? It means that when you write well, you distill it down to the essence. You're not dumbing it down, you're distilling it down to the essence and making it elegant and succinct and to the point to your audience, which is why he was such a phenomenal author. So as students, take a look at that, take a chance to do presentations, make mistakes, right? And learn how to do some of that analytics. And by the way, slip a finance class in if you can. I've got a ton of background in finance and economics, and it pays off every day of my life.
Okay, thank you for that. I think it's time for, I think the most enjoyable component of the panel. It's the Q&A period. So I think we do have a hot mic. So if you've got questions, feel free. We've got one up here. You can grab mine if you want. Yeah. Well, you don't have to. You can show. Well, I don't know.
Oh, here we have one in the back.
Yeah,
there we go.
And there's a
USC to the rescue.
So Dominic, I think my team and your team had a discussion a few weeks ago. My name is Stephen Lee. I'm the co-founder at Crowds.
Yeah.
Yeah. I think it was either your CEO talked to
me and
Yeah. I talked to my co-founder Payson. So I guess the question is this. In the free world, 60% of the economy is driven by small and medium businesses, right? I know Liquidx, for example, primarily focus on higher end type receivables, enterprise type of grade.
Not necessarily, but
Yeah.
I think I know where you're going with the
Yeah,
question.
yeah. So I guess the question is, I mean, you know, we have customers like Citibank, and MasterCard, and you know, the trend that I see is right now, the small and medium businesses don't have the financial girth to accept rates that are offered to them by financial institutions because of a lack of data, right? And so the question is, we talked about the pandemic, we talked about how do we improve the cash conversion cycle for small and medium businesses when it's hard to access that data, one, and number two, for an invoice that's $100,000 means nothing to Bank of America or Citibank, right? So what are some things that the industry is doing to kind of offset that, and really help the small and medium businesses? Because without the small and medium businesses, the economy tanks, at least in the free world, right? Specifically US and even in the UK. So that's my question.
Well, let me start. So you're asking a question that's been asked over the last 10 years. If you look at governmental initiatives, our Commerce Department, initiatives by the Bank of England and Her Majesty's Treasury in UK, et cetera. China has looked at it at a governmental level. Australia has a small business ombudsman that's supposed to support this sort of stuff. Getting financing access for small and medium-sized businesses in the trade world is super important. The biggest obstacle is two things. One is the businesses aren't set up to succeed in the current environment where technology takes you only so far. I made the comment about large companies having back offices that can throw bodies at it. Small businesses, generally, you're dealing with a CFO. Sometimes they may have a 2 or 3 person finance team. And that's a tough group to manage, effectively manage access to supply chain finance in the current environment. So digitization should, if it realizes its full potential, open the doors because it's easier to do things without having to have a lot of hands touching. So that's number one. Number two, one of the biggest challenges, especially with small and medium-sized businesses, in terms of being an ex-banker before I went into the fintech space, I could tell you when I ran my department, if a small and medium-sized businesses came to me and I said, show me your performance history on your receivables, because I'll be happy to finance Walmart if you sell to Walmart. Most small and medium-sized businesses could not, under the environment then, and still to this day, right? Because a lot of them run on spreadsheets. Give you good data that helps you analyze the credit risk that you're taking, right? Whether they're going to pay late, whether they're going to, there's a massive number of credit memos, all sorts of dilution impact, that, non-conforming goods, whatever it might be. The next stage of technology development is aimed to address those very things, so that a small business can have access or develop the data analysis of access to the data to give it to the financing sources. To hopefully, the plan is with that better data, pull down the rates. The other thing is what we're doing with digital ledger technology is basically allowing a company to take a purchase order through to maturity, payment, and reconciliation. Once everything's on a single ledger, fraud risk gets eliminated from the system. And that's another big thing with small and medium-sized businesses. So the technology should eliminate a number of the credit and performance issues that plague small and medium-sized business access to finance.
Oh, any other questions?
Hi, my name is Akanksha. My question is to all of you, and pardon if I'm being naive about this, but throughout the morning, we've been talking a lot about talent crunches and people crunch and having the right skills of people, etc. However, the first thing that people and companies most of the times do during a financial crunches either layoffs or freezing the hiring. And however, that should not be the case as per what I understand, because a right talent would then be suggesting the best solutions for us to get out of that kind of a crisis. So, what are your thoughts about it? And if that's not really the trend, then why is it that we resort to those kinds of solutions most of the times?
We're going to point at Alvin, just to,
I am not surprised.
if you don't know the
So-
answer, point at
Solve the
somebody
world's
else.
problems.
Yeah.
We'll give you answers,
So,
but
my perspective on that is that, fine, you're right. When there's a crisis, they're usually the first thing that you see are layoffs. But if you look at the difference in crisis, if you look at the financial crisis, there was a shrinkage in demand, right? Post-COVID, it's not the same thing. There's actually an increase in demand for CPG as an example, right? And there's a shortage in labor, right? So people are rethinking early retirement. So there's a shortage. I mean, for the longest time, we knew that baby boomers were going to retire, and, over time, there's going to be a shortage of labor, but this kind of accelerated that. So yes, there's still, issues with layoffs, but as a whole, I don't think that's the issue. The issue is you're still wanting skilled labor. The problem is the type of skill that you're looking for is continuously changing, because now it's more digitalization, and specific skill sets that you're looking for are not readily available, right? So that's my take on it. It's a crisis, but there's still that need for that people. I mean, when you look at everywhere, there's a need for specific supply chain, skilled labor, finance, and areas like that. It's that skill set that's the key, right? And knowing digitalization and technology is key to that, right? So I don't know if my colleagues want to.
if I can jump in on there. So when you're looking at skill sets, I'll give you a couple of examples. One, if you're a student and you're looking for companies to work for, different companies have different philosophies. Some of them are saying, like for COVID or other crises, I'm going to sustain my people and we're going to retain them. We're going to do some retraining or something while we do this. We're still investing in our people. Others did the layoffs. One of the short-sighted things that happened in COVID, at my university, we have a college of nursing, and so you get to see some of this medical stuff, and our sister campus is a top 20 medical center. So you see what happens in this particular domain. And the hospitals during COVID, the first thing they did because of this is they laid off a whole bunch of talented, skilled nurses, okay, who don't appreciate when they can't pay their mortgage. And so then they decided after COVID now, oh my gosh, we need some nurses back. Well, these nurses, highly skilled professionals, were not particularly keen to jump back to that particular hospital. So the hospitals that had better business practices were the recipients of these laid off nurses. Some of them had very high skill sets. They went into independent nursing care, working for companies to do specialized treatment. And so you get these individual level effects of the humans in the system picking on or picking companies that treat them better, that have better policies of people as assets. Now, I get if you're in a financial crisis, you have to cut, but the way they do it and how they do it and how they protect their skilled people tells you a lot, right? You can, look up Google or Bing or whatever you want and find out about a lot of these companies. And you can find out about industries and how they treat these skill sets. But whatever you do, take Alvin's advice and still keep investing in yourself. Things are going to change. Right now you're doing supply chain. Hopefully you're going to do some analytics. In 10 years, we're going to see some new flavors. Those will not die. Those will always pay off. But you're going to see some new things that happen, and you're going to want to keep investing in yourself. And whether you do that personally or go back to school or get some certificates or whatever it happens to be, just find ways to continue building your skill set. So when these problems happen, you're the cream of the crop that has first choice. When these crises happen, who's the first person that leaves a company? The most skilled that have the best opportunities. And they take the first best jobs that are available when it happens. So keep investing in yourself.
Okay, I think we're at time, so I think we're over time, actually.
Okay.
So wanted to thank everyone for coming, and it's been a pleasure. So enjoy the rest of the conference.